My name is David Forsey. I'm the Managing Director of the Aspen Cybersecurity Group. In case you didn't know, it is election season, and our leaders in the intelligence community and broader national security community have assured us that our adversaries will be using disinformation operations to achieve any number of their objectives. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Pamela Brown, Senior White House Correspondent for CNN, who will introduce and moderate our next session. Come on up.
Thank you, everybody. It's so great to see everyone here. This is obviously a very timely issue, and we have a great panel of experts who have also written books on the issue of disinformation and misinformation. So without further ado, let me introduce the panel here. As many of you know, this is Richard Stengel, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. We have Nina Jankowicz here, Global Fellow, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and Yasmin Green at the end there, Director of Research and Development for Jigsaw. And so as I was thinking about, starting off this discussion, what I think some people don't realize, even after 2016, is how much of a threat disinformation and misinformation campaigns continue to be, not only from international players, but also even domestically. And so, Richard, I want to start with you because you are really on the forefront of trying to counter disinformation campaigns at the State Department. As you look ahead to the 2020 election, how much of a systemic threat does disinformation campaigns pose, both domestically and internationally, for the election, but also for democracy?
Big question.
Yeah,
Thank
start
you,
off big.
Really delighted to be here. I want to thank Aspen and the sponsors. You didn't mention that I used to be the editor of Time Magazine, and every year we had the Time 100 party in this space, so I'm having a flashback right now, a positive one. I'm actually going to talk about the your last question, the problem for democracy, which is the 30,000-foot question, and governments are formed among men, and they derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Where does that come from? The Declaration of Independence. We obtain the consent of the governed through information, factual information. That's what Jefferson thought. That's what Adams thought. That's what all of the framers thought. The challenge to democracy is not having correct information for which we can't make accurate choices and votes. There's no more existential problem to democracy. So that's the big picture. The threat to 2020, I have this book coming out called Information Wars, How We Lost the Global Battle Against Disinformation. And it begins with the Russian threat and I know you write about this too, the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And we saw this tsunami of disinformation and misinformation and propaganda around it. What we didn't get, and I'm telling you the secret ending, we didn't realize that this was a kind of staging ground, a trial run for 2016. Nobody really saw that. But because we didn't really respond to what they did in 2016, the Russians and other powers, I think, feel that they can challenge us again in 2020 with impunity. There's no penalty. There has been no penalty. A few guys from the GRU being indicted by Bob Mueller, that doesn't seem like a big threat to the Russians. And the big threats in 2020, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, are deep fakes. And I think the platform companies have to take them off when they detect them. Domestic disinformation, which I think is on the rise, not only from extreme groups like white supremacists, but even from the left. And again, part of the solution, which we'll get to, is I always say we don't have a fake news problem. We have an information literacy problem. We need to teach people how to understand the provenance of information, true information, factual information. That is the core of helping people to participate in a democracy.
And as you've said, look, Russia doesn't have an off switch when it comes to this. There's nothing really deterring them from doing the same in 2020. And Nina, you have focused specifically on Russia, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and I'm curious if other adverse countries have seen Russia's success in 2016 and the concern about other countries trying to get into the space as well. on disinformation and misinformation. And I want to talk about that, and then we're going to get to the deepfake videos, because I think that's important too. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you're talking about, the Chinas, the Irans, et cetera.
Yes.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the Russian playbook has been split wide open, not only for other foreign actors, but for domestic actors, as Rick was just talking about. I did an investigation for BuzzFeed News last year during the midterms, where an independent candidate for Senate was using similar astroturfing techniques that we saw the Russians using in order to discredit Elizabeth Warren and kind of build himself as a grassroots pro-Trump candidate. And he ended up getting something like 10% of the popular vote in Massachusetts, all through these fake profiles online. Now, that being said, I think it's important to note that it's not just the inauthentic profiles, it's not just fake news stories that poses a problem for 2020. When we're talking about the threat to democracy, it's just the fact that now we have this discontent, this distrust of our system, not only of the information ecosystem, but of the election infrastructure, right? We know that Russia has been there rattling the door handles to our voter rolls. We know that other actors are doing the same thing. And as a voter, as somebody who doesn't, think about this every day, somebody who's not steeped in this world, that can be a very scary thing to think, does my vote matter? Does it really matter if I actually show up to vote? And not only does democracy depend on information, it depends on participation. And if we're losing that trust, which if you look at the polling information, not only are we losing the trust in the media, we're losing trust in government and our institutions writ large, that's the scariest thing for me, that people aren't gonna show up not only in 2020, but beyond.
Well, I mean, and just to be honest, the elephant in the room here is, of course, the president continues to push out this idea of fake news. You can't trust the election is rigged. Mm-hmm. As someone who works at CNN, I'm very familiar with that kind of rhetoric. And, and Yasmin, I'm gonna get to you in a minute on deep fakes, but Richard, you've touched on this in your book as well, the role the government plays.
Yes, I mean, the sad news is that government isn't the best entity, I don't think, to counter disinformation. I was at the soft end of soft power. I was dealing with content disinformation. I wasn't, and I'm not a technologist, I'm a content person. And my big revelation in government is, if you're against something, you just put the word counter in front of it and you've defeated it.
Yeah.
Counterintelligence, counter-terrorism. I mean, that's what happens. And we did. We created a counter-Russian messaging center as though that actually had any effect whatsoever. Government people are bad at creating content. They don't like creating content. That isn't the role that government needs to play.
They don't have the same metabolism, as you have said, as the media. It's a fast-moving environment out there. I mean, you got Twitter, you have all these different avenues, and you have to be able to counter it quickly. And Yasmin, you have been on the forefront of that at Jigsaw, countering ISIS recruitment efforts and so forth. And what we're seeing a proliferation of on that front are these deep fake videos, cheap fakes. We saw it with the Nancy Pelosi video, as you may recall, where it was slowed down to look like she was slurring her words. That spread rapidly. And so when that sort of takes off, when these deep fake, cheap fake videos take off, how do you counter that quickly? And how do you determine, how does the voter determine this is fake versus real?
Right. That's a really good question. Just want to say something on the domestic, the threat of domestic disinformation, which does actually link to video, which was one of the, so my group Jigsaw, we're part of Google, and we are looking at security threats from a kind of technical perspective, but also looking at kind of ethnographic research. And we do a lot of field work and try to understand how different security threats are playing out and how technology can help protect people. And we did some really interesting work around in 2016 in analyzing coordinated activity from the Internet Research Agency. And I think that kind of network analysis and the forensic kind of deep dives will let us detect a lot of that coordinated activity, especially when it's people who are operating accounts from abroad and pretending to be domestic. One of the stories that actually didn't, and there was a lot of discussion about fake news and that type of fake accounts, a lot of discussion about Russian fake accounts. But one of the stories that didn't get much coverage, which I was really fascinated by, was a story about a guy called Omowole, who was a self-defense trainer in Brooklyn, who was also a social justice activist. And in the beginning of 2015, somebody reached out to him through his Instagram and said, we are I don't think they quite said, maybe they said like a racial justice activist group, and we want to support African Americans through a number of pillars. They said through self-defense, through political activism, and through education. And would you please, we'd like to pay you to give self-defense courses to the African American community, which sounded right up his alley. So he said, okay. They negotiated some fee, like a couple $100 per week, per month, and he started opening his doors to people who were marketed to from this other organization. And the organization said, can you please let us, send us some kind of evidence that you've actually given these trainings? So can you video yourself, this self-defense class of African Americans taking your training? So he did, and then they sent him some swag, like they sent him a T-shirt that he should wear with their logo on it, and they asked for the consent forms, the waivers, which had these people's addresses. Anyway, so after a year, he maybe like 6 to 9 months, he said, this is going well, but when are we going to do the real, when are we going to, I want to do the actual activism stuff. What do you have planned? And he spoke to someone on the phone, and they said, I think the guy's name was Taylor, and Taylor told him, in the new year, so a full year later, we're going to get together. We have a network of self-defense trainers and other activists on the ground in America. We're going to get together for a big conference. So in between when they promised him that and when that conference was supposed to be, a journalist got in touch with him and let him know that the Black Fist was a front organization for the Russians. So he was an American who was kind of co-opted by the Russians to do something that to him felt very much in line with what, his social justice cause and his activism. So the notion that, I think the thing that's different is I'm not as worried about fake accounts this time, partly because there was so much exposure around that topic, and a lot of the accounts that had been seeded long before 2016 and had a lot of credibility by the time that they were active. Now they're kind of trying to start again from scratch. The defenses are working much better at the platforms. But this notion of Americans either knowingly or unknowingly participating in disinformation, I think, is a much bigger challenge. So in the case of, it's interesting, video was a factor there because Black Fist had an Instagram account with a whole bunch of videos that were real, that were really of different African-American groups getting training to build their own credibility as an organization. So that's at the one, I think deepfakes, kind of these AI-generated, manipulated video, very sophisticated at one end. Real videos that are somehow out of context and used to manipulate people are at the other end. And I think we're kind of concerned about the whole, the gamut of those deployments.
And just to kind of drive that home in terms of how this is being weaponized, Nina, how are we seeing this playing out? How are we seeing these cheap fake videos, disinformation campaigns being used as a weapon for domestic political gain? We're already seeing some of this play out in congressional races.
Absolutely. Well, I think what's interesting is you're seeing a lot of the IRA-generated memes, not Irish IRA, Internet Research Agency IRA, being recycled this time around. So it's not even cheap fakes as in the slowed down Pelosi video. It's just memes. It's just content that people are creating in order to, exacerbate the fissures in our societies. And just as an example, I was talking about Ukraine, which is a place I've spent a lot of time, and why would I be talking about that? I have no idea. On Washington Journal this weekend.
Nothing going on there.
Nothing going on. And this notorious call-in show where all sorts of people from all over the country call in and ask you questions. And in the mentions from that thread on my Twitter, it was just a load of nonsense, right? And I don't know how much of that was artificially generated. I think a lot of it was, just regular old trolls. But the point of this is there's a lot of that piling on from both sides, I will say, on both ends of the spectrum. We've got all sorts of people out there who just live on the internet. And I think it's really important, this goes back to information literacy. Not only do we need to not amplify those sources as members of the media, right? Let's check and make sure that those are real people behind those accounts. But let's have real conversations when we can. Let's go face to face and have the guts to say what we would say online to another human being.
Right. There's definitely that, and I don't use Twitter that much. I sort of stopped because it was just getting so ridiculous. But what I have seen as sort of an observer is sometimes these conspiracy theories take off. They have a life of their own. People enjoy them. They spread like wildfire. We saw that with the Seth Rich conspiracy theory in 2016. Julian Assange perpetuated that. And it seems like once, the train has left the station, it's hard to do anything, Richard. Whose responsibility is it to come out and say, this is wrong, this isn't true, here are the facts? Who's supposed to do that? Who has the ownership in the government to do that?
The very sad problem about disinformation and fake news is that it's not a supply problem, it's a demand problem. People want it. People want to look at fake stuff. I write a lot about the cognitive biases in the book that makes disinformation work. Confirmation bias. We look at stuff that we already agree with. We don't like to look at stuff that we don't agree with. Double down theory, where if you have a strongly held belief and you're given contradictory information, it makes you believe in that thing even more. So it's a problem. And I think I didn't pick up in your previous question your reference to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is the disinformationist in chief. He creates a climate that allows a lot of this stuff to flourish. And your specific question was about?
Well, just, these conspiracy theories that spread, like Seth Rich. I mean, who has ownership in the government, of this issue? And whose responsibility is it to come out and say, hey, this is wrong, here are the facts?
Well, so I'll get to that in a second, and I think the media has responsibility. So one of the things...
But hold on that though, so fact checks, CNN does fact checks all the time, but when you also have a president saying we're fake news...
By the way, I used to run a news organization, right?
Yeah, you did.
I don't believe in using illegally obtained content to publish it. CNN, every news organization used all of the emails that were published by WikiLeaks that were stolen from the DNC and stolen from individuals. In the Sony hack, people published all the emails that the North Koreans sold. That's using illegally obtained information. The media should not do it. It should be like, no, sorry, we're not doing that. The other thing that the role of government, and I talk about this in the book, and I'm sorry to keep mentioning my book.
You have a book coming up?
Yeah. I wanted to give everyone a copy here today, but Aspen said no. Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act. The platform companies all need to have more liability for the stuff that they publish. They are publishers. They're the biggest publishers in the history of civilization. That's how we get a lot of this stuff off these platforms.
And I want to dig in a little bit deeper onto where the liability should be, how much liability and social media role. But before I get to that, there is this question, right, of, look, the US government doesn't police misinformation domestically. When it comes to censorship, there's a fine line between misinformed free speech and deceptive disinformation campaigns. Nina, how do you draw that line and decide where it is, given a country where we do have free speech? We have the First Amendment.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And if we were in Europe, this conversation would be very, very different because they have a much different relationship to freedom of speech there and a much, I think, the historical memory of what it was like to have that speech taken away means that they think very carefully before they do it, but they're also not afraid to do it in order to protect that speech. Because let's be real, through these disinformation campaigns, people's speech is actually being quashed. It's not being upheld. When we have people who are astroturfing and hate speech going on, the point of that is to suppress opinion, suppress real discussion, not amplify it. So I think we have to be real about that. Now, that being said, I think the solution has to be whole of society, which is a word that we throw around a lot, especially in venues like these, right? We need cooperation from the tech platforms, good faith cooperation and enforcement of terms of service. But we also need people in the government who are willing to say, yes, this is a problem, and it's not just about foreign actors, although we haven't even gotten that far in the United States of America. There is still plenty of people who question whether or not Russia interfered in the 2016 election at the governmental level. So we need a recognition from our commander-in-chief and all of those around him that this is a problem, not only on the foreign side, but on the domestic side as well, and that there are people all across this political spectrum using the tools that Russia used and that advertisers use on a daily basis, I might add, to target people with these kind of very deleterious messages. We have to recognize that, and there's a lot of privacy implications for all of that. What data do we want to be sharing with the social media companies? Do people really realize that when you log on to Facebook to share a picture of your dog or your child, all of the data that you are sharing therein in order to have that pleasure, right? And I think there's a big public education campaign that needs to happen there. And that, I think, is where government really has a role. I agree with Rick that, government is not a good messenger generally, especially with the lack of trust that we have between society and government right now. But what government can do is invest in its people in terms of civic education. Like, this just isn't about learning how to use the internet safely. It's also about learning how to be a good citizen. We've lost that sense of civics, and a lot of the disinformation around 2016 was about how the primary system worked, right? So educating people about that, educating them about digital and media literacy, but not just kids, the voting age population as well. And I think that's where there's room for a lot of collaboration between the government and the people who are gathered here today.
So you have the government, you have these social media companies, these private companies, Yasmin. And we have seen tech companies like Facebook take on a much larger role in combating this since 2016. A lot of lessons were learned. In your view, what more should they be doing? And how much liability should tech companies, private companies, as Richard pointed out, have in what is published on their sites?
I do commend Facebook. I see them doing a lot, and they should, and I think they are. I think probably we're going to see more disinformation across other platforms. I think it was quite centralized to Facebook and Twitter in 2016. I think it's going to become many more people's problems in 2020. And I think your point about, firstly, I think that they have a very strong incentive to not be the hosts of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and fake peddlers. Like, one of the biggest threats to, if you think that more than 90% of their revenue is coming from advertising, no advertiser wants to be, show up against white genocide conspiracy theories or, Russian trolled accounts. So I think the incentives from just a business perspective, also from employees, I think they're all aligned and headed in the right direction. I think where the jury's a little bit still out is on what those interventions should look like. You can pursue the activity to take it down. We spoke about that, like network signals and forensic analysis. But are there interventions that are less punitive? They're not about filtering or censorship, but potentially still viable. So one of the things that I've been interested in is inoculation. So can we expose people, can we kind of condition people to be more resilient to mis and disinformation when they encounter it? There's a really encouraging study that looked at, that gave half the subjects exposure to the techniques used by climate change deniers, specifically around kind of false balance and using people who are not climate change scientists to give the impression that there isn't a consensus about human-made climate change. And the half of the subjects that were exposed to it before being exposed to the techniques were much more resilient to the propaganda. And then when those treatment was reversed, so people were exposed to the climate change denial propaganda, and then told how the technique works of trying to seed doubt, they were not immune to it. So I think there's some really interesting kind of lab studies that suggest that we could maybe teach people to be more skeptical of disinformation and misinformation. There's also a game that's created by some Dutch researchers called Get Bad News that puts people in the role of fake news peddlers, just to kind of teach them some of the techniques that are used. And we took it out into the field and tested it on people, actually older people, to see if we could help them become more resilient. And the really encouraging thing was that they were much better at spotting fake news headlines after they'd played this game. But they also thought that all the real headlines were also fake news. So I think they were just really nihilistic at the end of it, which isn't right. Yeah. I'll share one other kind of practical research example from ourselves. We have some research together with Google AI to build detection of deepfakes. And we just last week published the world's largest and most diverse deepfakes data set, so that researchers can really practice on a range of different deepfakes practice, building robust detection. But the question we asked ourselves was, if you could detect perfectly any deepfake, what would you do? You know, and I think there was a mention that, you know, we have to take it offline, but is that right? If I want to make a deepfake of my child or swap my children's faces, or, you know, if I want to do it for an art project, should that not be allowed on the internet? Are we suggesting that there should be an absolute, like, no tolerance policy to deepfakes? Probably not. So ideally, there's some kind of intervention that helps people interact with that disinformation or misinformation and be able to see it for what it is. So we ran a test where we made a deepfake of Walter Matthau doing a comedy skit, and we put Richard Nixon in his, instead, we made it Richard Nixon giving the comedy performance. And then we took a sample of a couple hundred people from across the country, across income groups, political affiliation, et cetera. And we showed them the deepfake. And then we showed them 3 interfaces. All 3 of them were different ways of saying this is a fake video. So we had an interstitial, we had a label, we said altered content, fabricated content. Okay, in the best of these treatments, interventions, what percentage of people do you think said that the fake video that they were told was fake? 38%. So
even after they were told that it was fake?
It was a fake video, and they were told it was fake, and not more than half of them thought that it was fake. And then we actually asked the question, are you familiar with Richard Nixon's background in comedy? And 17% of them said that they were familiar with it. So I don't even know. You know, so the technological problem is real, but I think, you know, when I think about it, what do we need to do to be better prepared? What's that?
How many familiar with Richard Nixon at all?
So I think, you know, one of the things that we're excited about is bringing kind of more of this type of kind of ethnographic user, you know, focus group, like bringing psychologists and sociologists to help us understand what's happening in the human brain and not just what's happening on the computer.
And this gets to my sort of the core question here. You just hit on this intersection between technology and sort of trust that people have, right? I mean, so you can detect a video as fake through technology, right? You can say, no, this is fake. But when people don't have trust in their institutions, you know, in the media, when they're told the media is fake news, you can't believe anything they say, how do you convince them it's fake? I mean, what do you do, especially in an election year, if, you know, there's a video going out of a politician saying something that politician didn't actually say, but it was created through artificial intelligence, and you have CNN saying, this is not true, and providing evidence, but people have lost faith in the media. I mean, what do you do about that?
Yeah, I think the most pernicious aspect of the Russian assault on our system and disinformation in general is not that it makes people believe things that are false, it makes them mistrust things that are true. They can't tell the difference. You know, Russian active measures, which I'm sure, Nina, you write about in your book, which has been going on since, you know, the whole Cold War. The idea wasn't so much to persuade people that our view is true, but to make them distrust all their sources of information. It makes them, Peter Pomerantsev, who you must know his work, has a great line, which I keep trying to steal, but I keep giving him credit for it. He says, we're not in an information war, we're in a war on information. And basically, it's this idea that empirical facts are not to be trusted. That's what's so dangerous. And so even when CNN or Time or anybody says something is not true, there's also this cognitive bias that a woman named Emily Thorson writes about called belief echoes, which is that even when you take something that Donald Trump tweets that is untrue, and you retweet it and say, this is untrue for all these reasons, it creates a belief echo. You remember the original piece of misinformation or disinformation. It's not disabused by the fact. That's a problem. I actually think that's another reason why the press, and if I was still in media, and I sort of am, I would actually, you know, show what the president does much less. Because even when he does something that is untrue, you say that it's untrue, it still creates a belief echo. And the final thing I'll say, just because we've all touched on this, and I also talk about this in the book, the First Amendment is about government not restricting free speech. Congress shall make no law. Those are the first 4 amendments of the first 4 words of the First Amendment. It doesn't restrict Google or Facebook. Their terms of service are their constitution. They can take off false content. And I think one of the things that has to be done is a false speech law, which is that verifiably false content must be removed. Unfortunately, and I should say this gloriously, the First Amendment protects false content. That's why Europeans don't understand the First Amendment and why it is an outlier. And that's a whole bigger discussion, which I won't bore you with now, but that is something that we should all be thinking about.
Yeah, that gets to this whole idea of where do you draw the line? You can say something.
So I think what we need to do, rather than just fact-checking or playing, as I like to call it, whack-a-troll, where we're just removing these fake accounts, right, and telling people what is false and what isn't, is we need to bring agency back into the equation. And in my book, which you can buy.
What's the title?
It's called How to Lose the Information War. It'll be out next summer. So I look at a lot of different interventions that the Eastern Europeans have done, from Estonia to Georgia to Poland to Ukraine. And the more successful anti-disinformation, counter-disinformation measures have really dealt with this agency, not only in terms of media literacy and digital literacy, but in bringing back people to the democratic process. And so when we're talking about, verifying information online, rather than putting a label on something, which actually Facebook's early interventions on that haven't been very successful either, I am all for equipping people with the tools that they need to decide if this thing, if this piece of information is trustworthy. Because you know what? People want to be right. We might not be able to change their minds about the things that they believe or that they want to argue about, but they want to be supporting themselves with information that is correct. They don't want to be proven wrong in a public forum. So I think that's the key there. It's really hard, and it takes more than just, putting a label on things, and it takes cooperation across sectors again. And it's not something, I know it's very frustrating to hear somebody say, like, we need to have this generational approach to countering disinformation, but you know what? The Russians have been doing this for a very, very long time, and we're not going to be able to snap our fingers or wave a magic wand and just remove all of the bad content online, not to mention the domestic issue, which is becoming more and more important. So I encourage everybody to think about those more citizens-based generational solutions that bring back people into the process, because them getting cut out is what kind of made them seek out this false and bad information in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are these education programs in other countries on this, and my colleague Evan Perez on CNN went to Ukraine, was speaking to young journalism students, and they were really sort of disheartened. They said people in Ukraine don't believe what they see and hear. And I was talking to Evan, I said, Evan, do you think that we're headed in that direction? Like, we could actually get to a place where in America where people don't believe what they see and hear. What do you think, Yasmin?
I really like Nina's point, and I wonder just to apply that to that user research that we did on deepfake interventions. If we had done something different, if we had maybe shown people visually where on the video the alteration had happened, something really visceral to help them understand it. I'm interpreting that as a failure in our experiment, our treatment, our intervention design, and I don't think it's doomed that we can design interventions that work with people. And I've been researching conspiracy theories quite a bit recently because they both intersect with the state-sponsored disinformation. I mean, the Russians created anti-vaxxer accounts. In the Philippines, the elections this year were full of disinformation from all sides, and they had infiltrated the Flat Earth movement and were using that movement to disseminate pro-Duterte propaganda. And also from a violent extremism perspective, which I care a lot about that issue, we do at Jigsaw, this notion of white genocide and great replacement has been cited in every single manifesto and by every single lone shooter over the last year. So I've been kind of trying to understand the bunk, to think about how to debunk, and getting a little bit, sometimes a bit too close to these conspiracy theories. But I have come to understand that these people are, the 9/11. That 9/11 conspiracy theory, they call themselves the truther movement. This notion of seeking truth, of being critical thinking, of being open-minded, that is that's how we identify it. I'm sure everyone in here identifies with those characteristics and values, and that's how they identify too. And in that, I see an opportunity, because if we can make information accessible to them in a way that's visceral, in a way that they can process, I think that we do have a shot of inoculating people, making them more resilient.
But the conspiracy theories fascinate me. I mean, I've been a subject of conspiracy theories. You know, I had a focus group during the election, and there was a technical issue that the group couldn't hear what the soundbite was, so I was telling one of the participants so that she knew what to respond to. And the mic caught me telling her saying to her what the soundbite was, and then she repeated what I said. And so it spread like wildfire on the internet that I was coaching this participant of the focus group. And that's on the internet forever. I mean, you Google me, and I still get people who tweet at me and say, you know, oh yeah, you coach the focus group and this and that. And, you know, what do you do about that, Richard? Because conspiracy theories are tricky. I mean, people want to believe what they want to believe. In that video, you do hear the audio, and you know, and then it got distorted into this other thing. What do you do about that? And I don't know that there is a solution.
Well, one solution was the European Right to Be Forgotten law, which I guess was just then struck down vis-a-vis Google and in the domestic USA. Is that,
yeah.
I'm sure someone here knows more about that than I do. I mean, that's this idea that was, I guess, started in a French court, that if there is information about you which is incorrect, which you don't want to have it live forever on the internet, you have a right to have it taken down. And that does dovetail what I was saying before about a kind of a false speech law that I think it is incumbent upon platforms to take demonstrably false information down. I mean, the problem with conspiracy theories is, I mean, you know, they've been around forever. I mean, there's, you know, from the time there was information, there was disinformation.
And how do you can provide all the facts, but people said, nope, that's not right. You know, they want to believe what they want to believe.
Well, that's true, and that's confirmation bias. And then the other great line that I use in the book is Mark Twain, who said, it's a lot easier to fool someone than to persuade them they've been fooled, which is the problem with disabusing people of believing conspiracy theories, because no one wants to think, oh, I was wrong about this. So I'm offering no hope on this whatsoever. So.
You know, and it's interesting. I was thinking, Nina, there are so many reviews out there, right, for products. Just follow me. I'm going somewhere with this. So if you go on Amazon, there's all kinds of reviews. And there are now sites that tell you whether the reviews are credible. They say, okay, this is not just this product manufacturer who's writing the review. This is a verified user and so forth. And I was thinking, like, is there a way to do that, like a third party sort of verify that information is accurate? Because we are at sort of this moment of crisis where people just don't trust the information they're being given by mainstream media. I mean, not everyone, obviously, but there is sort of this trend. You're seeing it go in that direction.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of against reinventing the wheel in that regard. Like, I think if people are using all of their faculties and looking at information from multiple sources and painting the whole picture, they should be able to piece all that stuff together themselves if they have the tools. The problem is there's always going to be some section of society that's kind of left behind by that. There are always going to be people we can't convince. So I guess I'm also a little bit pessimistic in that regard, particularly as we deal with this conspiracy theory about Joe Biden and Ukraine right now, which, having worked in Ukraine, I know to be demonstrably false, and I can tell that story over and over and over again, but it doesn't convince the people who are calling into Washington Journal on Saturday, right?
Yeah, and like Richard said, you see allies of the president kind of using this to their advantage by they're getting the message out.
Right.
You know what I mean? They're still talking about it, and so people hear it.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's most concerning to me. And again, looking at the comparative cases that I did in my book, the governments that have bought into the fact that this is a threat to democracy, no matter your political inclination, are ones that are doing a much better job addressing the problem. And those that are using it as a political football are just digging themselves a deeper hole. So my plea, and a lot of the work that I'm doing at the Wilson Center in the coming year, will be educating legislators about how to talk not only about this in the chambers of Congress, but also with their constituents as a threat to democracy, not a political issue. issue.
And Yasmin, you know, you've been on the forefront of combating ISIS recruitment efforts. When we were talking this backstage, there are parallels. While ISIS was sort of, they advertised, they were true to who they were. They weren't trying to pretend like they were someone else. There are a lot of parallels between what terrorists have done online in recruiting people and what we've seen from Russia and other countries in the disinformation campaigns. And you said one of the things that they do is sort of, they know how to pinpoint people's vulnerabilities, their desires, their weak points, and they exploit that.
Right. And I think that's one of the things, like, we need to kind of respect the adversary here in terms of that this isn't just that they're some kind of like tech savviness on the part of the Internet Research Agency that, you know, they out-innovated us. Actually, they used a pretty sophisticated understanding of the prejudices and the insecurities of people and communities in the US, and they do this abroad. And ISIS did that too when they were recruiting. I went to Iraq to interview people who had left ISIS, like fighters who'd left home and then trained in the caliphate and then defected, which is like, ISIS has a very open door policy, but you're not allowed to leave. So they had like risked their life to leave. And the stories they tell me about why they joined, you know, I want to go and defend the rights of Muslims and fight for freedom. And then going to the UK and interviewing like young women and girls, and a girl who was as young as 13 who said that she wanted to join the Islamic State because, I remember so clearly this conversation because I was sitting in front of her and she was with her father, and I had known about her, and I just had no idea how she was going to answer the question, why did you try to join ISIS? And she said, because I wanted to go and live in the Islamic Disney world. So like this isn't, there's not like some incredible, you know, zero-day exploit they used to manipulate that girl and that foreign fighter to go and join ISIS. So I think that's why I'd advocate not only for punitive responses, but also to try to help, just as Nina said, you know, help people build their resilience to manipulation.
Yeah, the rudimentary tactics just on the emotional level that gets people hooked. Well, thank you so much, guys. This was such a interesting, worthwhile educational discussion for me. At least I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. Thank you to our experts.
Yes, thank you.